12 miles off the coast of Maine, the Atlantic Ocean doesn't have a floor, it only has a hungry, freezing dark. For 65-year-old Elias, a rogue wave was all it took to turn his trawler into a steel coffin. He's trapped 60 feet down in a shrinking air pocket, listening to the hull groan under a pressure that's seconds away from crushing him alive. The Coast Guard has called off the search, claiming the storm is unsurvivable. But Barnacle, a one-eyed retriever Elias rescued from a wreck years ago, isn't waiting for a rescue boat. He's already diving into the black abyss to find the only heart he's ever known. This is the story of the dog who swam into a hurricane to pay a debt of life. Chapter 1: The Iron Cradle. The Maine coastline is a jagged cathedral of granite and cold Atlantic brine, a place where the fog rolls in like a shroud and the sea never truly sleeps. For 65-year-old Elias, the ocean was more than a workplace, it was a sanctuary. He was a man of the tides, his skin cured like leather by decades of salt and wind. His only constant companion was the sea glass, a sturdy 30-foot trawler that had carried him through 40 winters of ice and gale. Inside the cabin, the air always smelled of diesel, old cedar, and the wet dog scent of Barnacle, a one-eyed Chesapeake Bay Retriever. Barnacle wasn't just a pet, he was a survivor of the very sea they worked. 5 years ago, Elias had pulled a shivering, half-drowned pup from the wreckage of a lobster boat after a nor'easter. He had named him Barnacle because, from that day on, the dog refused to be pried away from his side. The sea glass was their iron cradle, a vessel that moved with a predictable rhythm Elias could feel in his bones. He trusted the boat and he trusted the dog's ears, which often twitched toward a coming storm long before the barometer began to drop. On this Tuesday afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, sickly purple, and the waves began to stack, a sign that the Atlantic was preparing to settle an old score. A freak of a squall-lined surge, a wall of water 30 feet high, appeared out of the mist like a mountain. Elias didn't even have time to key the radio. The sea glass was hit broadside, the force of the impact shattering the reinforced portholes and throwing the vessel onto its beam ends. The world inverted, the floor became the ceiling, and the roar of the ocean filled the cabin with a violent, freezing rush. Elias was thrown against the engine block, his shoulder popping with a sickening crunch. As the boat rolled completely over, the air was replaced by a churning, dark green chaos. He scrambled for the surface, but the sea glass was already heavy with water, its steel hull acting like an anchor. He was being dragged down into the basement of the world, a place where the light of the sun is a distant memory. The boat settled into a slow, terrifying descent, sinking toward a rocky underwater ridge 60 feet below. Elias found himself trapped in a small, pressurized air pocket near the stern, his head pressed against the cold steel of the hull. He was gasping for air that smelled of oil and panic, listening to the groaning of the rivets as the water pressure began to squeeze the ship. Outside, the storm was a screaming madness of white foam and black water. Barnacle had been thrown clear of the wreck during the roll, bobbing like a cork in the massive swells. Most dogs would have paddled for the distant, rocky shore, driven by the primal instinct to save themselves. But Barnacle didn't look at the land. He stayed at the boil, the spot where the sea glass had vanished, his one eye fixed on the rising bubbles. He began to circle the wreckage site, his powerful chest heaving as he fought the riptide. He wasn't swimming for survival, he was swimming for the echo. He could feel the low-frequency vibration of the boat's engine, which was still coughing out its final mechanical breaths beneath the surface. To Barnacle, the ocean wasn't a barrier, it was a map, and his alpha was disappearing from the grid. Chapter 2: The Sinking Silence. Inside the capsized hull, the silence was more terrifying than the roar of the storm. The only sound was the rhythmic glug-glug of air escaping through the cracks in the cabin door. Elias was chest-deep in freezing brine, his body shaking so violently he could barely hold onto the overhead pipes. He knew the physics of his situation, every bubble that left the room was a second of life he would never get back. The cold was a physical predator, biting into his muscles and slowing his heart. At 60 feet down, the pressure against the ears is a constant, sharp pain, and the darkness is absolute. Elias reached out into the blackness, his fingers brushing against floating debris, a life jacket he couldn't reach, a toolbox that had become a jagged weapon. He was a prisoner in his own sanctuary, waiting for the ocean to finish its work. He thought of the drowned pup he had pulled from the water years ago. He remembered the way Barnacle's tiny heartbeat had felt against his palm, a flickering spark he had refused to let go out. He realized with a heavy, hollow irony that they were now in the same position, only this time, there was no one left on the surface to cast a net. The Coast Guard wouldn't launch a diver in a hurricane for a single fishing boat. The air pocket was shrinking. The water was now at his chin, forcing him to tilt his head back against the cold metal. He could feel the sea glass shifting on the underwater ridge, leaning toward a 1,000-foot trench that dropped off into the abyss. If the boat slid another foot, the pressure would crush the hull like a soda can. He was standing on the edge of eternity, and the door was closing. Elias closed his eyes and whispered a name into the rising water. It wasn't a prayer to a saint or a plea to the heavens. He whispered Barnacle, a final, desperate anchor to the world above. He wanted the dog to be safe. He wanted the one-eyed survivor to find a new PA, a new boat, and a new hand to feed him. He didn't want the ocean to claim both of them on the same dark afternoon. Above him, the dog was doing the impossible. Barnacle wasn't just floating, he was diving. He would plunge his head beneath the surface, his sensitive ears tracking the metallic moan of the sinking ship. He was a Chesapeake Bay Retriever, a breed developed for the icy waters of the Atlantic, and his coat was a waterproof shield. But no dog was built for a 60-foot descent into a pressure cooker. Barnacle took a massive breath, his lungs expanding to their limit, and dove. He followed the trail of oil and silver bubbles that rose from the sea glass. The pressure hammered at his eardrums, and the darkness tried to blind his one good eye, but he pushed forward with a rhythmic, powerful kick. He was a biological torpedo, a heat-seeking missile locked onto the scent of his savior. He reached the hull of the boat, his paws scraping against the slime-covered steel. He didn't have hands to open a door or tools to break the glass, but he had a voice. He pressed his muzzle against the reinforced porthole and let out a muffled, underwater bark, a vibration that traveled through the steel and into the very air pocket where Elias was taking his final, ragged breaths. Chapter 3, The Impossible Swim. The vibration hit Elias like an electric shock. He felt a dull thump-thump against the glass, a sound that didn't belong to the shifting of the tide or the groaning of the metal. He reached out, his hand shaking, and pressed his palm against the porthole. On the other side, through the dark, murky green of the Atlantic, he saw a ghost, a one-eyed dog, surrounded by a halo of bubbles, pressing his face against the glass. The sight broke the trance of Elias's hypothermia. He realized that Barnacle wasn't just there to witness his end, he was there to be a marker. If the dog was here, the surface was close. If the dog could find him, perhaps the world hadn't forgotten him yet. Elias began to hammer back against the glass with his heavy brass flashlight, a rhythmic SOS that sent sound waves screaming through the water. Barnacle's lungs were burning. The carbon dioxide was building up in his blood, demanding that he return to the surface for air. But the retriever refused to break the link. He swam in tight, frantic circles around the cabin, looking for a way in. He was a dog possessed by a singular mission, his one eye glowing in the dark as he searched for the man who had once pulled him from the same fate. Finally, the physical limit of his lungs forced Barnacle to kick for the surface. He shot upward like a breaching whale, his head breaking the water just as a Coast Guard Jayhawk helicopter crested the wave line. The pilot, Lieutenant Miller, was about to turn back due to zero visibility, but he saw something impossible, a dog's head, bobbing in the center of a hurricane, miles from any shore. "I've got a V-wake in the water," Miller shouted over the radio. "There's a dog out here." If the dog is here, the boat is directly beneath him. The helicopter pivoted, its searchlight cutting through the rain to find the exhausted retriever. Barnacle didn't swim toward the rescue basket. He stayed in a fixed hover, treading water over the exact spot where the sea glass was snagged on the ridge. The Coast Guard divers, specialized in heavy sea extraction, dropped into the water. They followed Barnacle's lead, descending into the dark with high-powered torches. They saw the retriever's paws frantically paddling above them, acting as a living buoy for the rescue team. Beneath the surface, the torches caught the silver reflection of the sea glass, dangling over the abyss. Inside, Elias was down to his last 2 inches of air. He was breathing the very ceiling of the cabin, his lips touching the cold metal. He saw the first flicker of the diver's lights through the porthole, a starlight glow in the tomb. He gave one final, desperate blow with his flashlight against the glass. "I'm here. Don't let the ocean take me." The divers moved with a speed born of desperation. They knew the air pocket was failing. Using a hydraulic jaws of life, they pried at the cabin door, the hinges screaming as the pressure equalized. Just as the sea glass began to slide off the ridge and into the 1,000-foot trench, a diver reached in, grabbed Elias by his life vest, and hauled him into the open water. Chapter 4: The Beacon in the Black. The ascent was a blur of nitrogen and salt. Elias was hauled to the surface, his lungs screaming as he took his first breath of the storm-lashed air. He was hoisted into the helicopter, his body a shivering wreck of grey skin and blue lips. But as the medics began to wrap him in thermal blankets, Elias fought them off. He pointed back at the churning, black water. "The dog! Where is the dog?" Barnacle was drifting. The adrenaline that had fueled his 5-mile swim and his 60-foot dive had finally evaporated, leaving him a hollow shell. His one good eye was closed, and his powerful legs were no longer moving. He was sinking, his heavy coat finally soaking up enough water to pull him down. The retriever who had saved the man was about to be reclaimed by the deep. Lieutenant Miller saw the dog slipping beneath the foam. "Rescue 1, the marker is submerged. I repeat, the dog is going down." A second diver, Mike, didn't wait for the winch. He dove from the cabin door of the helicopter, a 40-foot drop into the chaos. He swam with a frantic, sprawling stroke, reaching into the dark. Just as Barnacle's tail disappeared, Mike grabbed the dog by the scruff of his neck, pulling the heavy, waterlogged body to his chest. He could feel the retriever's heart, a slow, irregular thump, thump, that felt like a dying battery. "I've got him. Get us up!" Mike screamed into his headset. The winch groaned as it pulled the diver and the dog out of the Atlantic's hungry grip. When Barnacle was laid on the floor of the helicopter, he didn't breathe. His lungs were full of salt water, and his body was the temperature of the sea. The medics, who were supposed to be focusing on Elias, found themselves performing CPR on a dog. Mike used 2 fingers to compress the retriever's chest, while Elias watched from the corner, his eyes leaking salt water that wasn't from the ocean. "Come on, Barnacle," Elias whispered, his voice a dry, salt-cracked rasp. "You don't get to leave me here. You don't get to pay the debt today." For 60 agonizing seconds, the only sound in the helicopter was the roar of the engines and the rhythmic press release of Mike's fingers. The dog stayed silent, a wet, scarred ghost of the harbor. Suddenly, Barnacle's body convulsed. He let out a wet, hacking cough, spraying salt water across the medic's boots. His one eye flew open, wide and panicked, as his lungs finally found oxygen. He looked around the cramped, noisy cabin of the Jayhawk, his gaze landing on the man wrapped in silver blankets. He let out a weak, exhausted whine and tried to crawl toward him. Elias reached out a shaking hand and buried his fingers in the dog's matted fur. They sat there, 2 survivors of the abyss, as the helicopter banked away from the storm and toward the lights of the mainland. The sea glass was gone, claimed by the 1,000-foot trench, but the iron cradle of their bond remained. The ocean had taken the steel, but it couldn't take the soul. Chapter 5: The Debt of the Deep. The recovery at the hospital was a slow process of the blood warming and the lungs clearing. Elias spent a week in the ICU, his body fighting off the saltwater pneumonia that comes from breathing a sinking ship. But he wasn't alone. The Coast Guard, moved by the story of the retriever's dive, had bent the rules. Barnacle was allowed to stay in a kennel in the hospital's courtyard, visiting Elias every afternoon. The story of the ghost of the abyss became a legend in the Maine fishing fleet. They talked about the dog who swam 5 miles into a hurricane and the man who kept a flashlight moving in a tomb. It was a story that reminded the hardened sailors that the sea is not the only force of nature, that loyalty is a tide that never goes out, and a debt of life is never truly paid. Elias lost his boat and his livelihood that day, but he realized he had gained something far more valuable. He saw the way people looked at Barnacle, not as a one-eyed mutt, but as a guardian of the deep. He realized that the drowned pup he had rescued 5 years ago had spent every day since then training for the moment he would have to return the favor. When Elias was finally discharged, he didn't go back to a new boat. He went back to the pier where he and Barnacle had spent so many years. They sat on the same weathered bench, watching the waves roll in. The ocean looked the same as it always had, vast, cold, and indifferent. But Elias knew the truth: the ocean has a basement, and he had seen the bottom and come back. Barnacle sat at his feet, his frost-scarred ears twitching in the wind. He was slower now, his joints aching from the pressure of the dive, but his one good eye was still fixed on the horizon. He wasn't looking for a new wreck, he was just watching the water, making sure the monsters stayed down. He was the maritime protector, the sentinel of the salt. Elias often thinks about the moment the air pocket vanished. He remembers the feeling of the water at his lips and the sight of the bubbles around Barnacle's face. He realizes that the dog hadn't just saved his life, he had saved his faith in the world. He had proven that even in the most absolute darkness, there is a link that cannot be broken. The harbor community eventually rallied together, raising the funds to buy Elias a new, smaller boat. He named it the Barnacle's Debt. It's a modest vessel, but it's sturdy and true. Every morning, the one-eyed retriever hops onto the deck, takes his position at the bow, and scans the water. They don't go out as far as they used to, but they always go out together. If you ever visit the coast of Maine, you might see them, an old man with a slight limp and a dog with one eye and a coat the color of a stormy sea. They don't talk much, because they don't have to. They share a silence that was forged 60 feet down, in a world where words don't exist and only the heartbeat matters. They are the survivors of the abyss. Chapter 6: The Spirit of the Salt. The sea glass still lies at the bottom of the 1,000-foot trench, a playground for the deep-sea crabs and the slow currents. It is a monument to the day the Atlantic tried to claim a soul and failed. It is a reminder that we are only as strong as the ones who refuse to let us sink. The iron may rust, and the wood may rot, but the spirit of the rescue remains. Elias is 70 now, and his days on the water are numbered. But he isn't afraid of the end. He knows that when the final tide comes for him, he won't be alone. He knows that there is a one-eyed guardian waiting for him, a dog who knows the way through the dark and back to the light. He has learned that death is just another ocean, and he has the best navigator in the world. The lesson of the ghost of the abyss is a simple one: kindness is the only currency that matters in a storm. The broth Elias fed the pup, the warm towels he used to dry his fur. And the years of gentle words, those were the bricks Barnacle used to build the bridge back to the surface. We save them so that, one day, they can save us. The North Atlantic continues to roar against the Maine granite, a restless giant that never stops looking for a way in. But on the pier, the iron cradle of the bench is safe. Elias and Barnacle sit in the sun, the heat of the day soaking into their bones. They have beaten the cold, and they have beaten the dark. They are a pack of two, and the sea has no power over them. We tell this story because the world is a deep and dangerous place. We tell it because we all have ghost ships in our past, moments when we felt the water rising and the air running out. We tell it to remind ourselves that there is always a Barnacle out there, a protector who is listening for our heartbeat in the silence of the abyss. As you watch the moon rise over the water tonight, think of the guardians of the deep. Think of the ones who would dive into a hurricane for you, and the ones who would stay at the boil until the very end. We are defined by the ones we pull from the wreckage, and we are saved by the ones who refuse to let us drown. Barnacle lets out a soft, contented sigh, his head resting on Elias's knee. The ocean is quiet tonight, the waves whispering against the pilings. The debt is paid, the air is full, and the lights of the harbor are glowing bright. The one-eyed dog closes his eye, finally allowing himself to drift into a sleep that is no longer cold. If Barnacle's dive into the dark reminded you that love has no depth, don't let his story stay on this pier. Share it with those who feel like they are sinking. Because no matter how deep the water or how dark the night, there is always a way back to the surface if you have someone who refuses to let go of your hand, or your heart. The ocean is deep, but a dog's loyalty is deeper. If Barnacle's sacrifice moved your soul, help us honor the guardian of the abyss. Smash that like button to salute Barnacle and every rescue animal that became a savior of the sea. Subscribe to Paws That Saved Lives, where we bring you the most thrilling and dramatic cinematic legends of nature's heroes. Comment Barnacle below if you believe a dog's love can reach the bottom of the ocean.